So, as a follow up to the previous video about the involvement of the United Kingdom in World War II and why it was so decisive, I wanted to talk a bit about the Napoleonic Wars because it was a very similar situation where Britain kept fighting France, but a lot of the other countries would sometimes be allies of France, sometimes be neutral, sometimes be enemies, and it just kept going. But Britain was consistently at war with France and pretty much consistently blockaded it throughout the war. Now, once again, something that always bothered me was if Napoleon had control of most of Europe, and he had the huge population of France, and he had all the German states, and he had Italy occupied, why couldn't he just build his own fleet? I mean, surely he had more workers and that sort of thing at his disposal. There's also the issue of France at the time didn't have a huge overseas empire. They had sold Louisiana to the United States, so they didn't have to spread their forces thin across the world. They also didn't have to blockade the entire Mediterranean and Atlantic like the UK did. So you'd think they'd be able to just muster all their forces together, build a new fleet up in the Mediterranean, and crush the British. So there's a couple issues with why they weren't able to do that. Interestingly, one of the impacts of the blockade was it destroyed the French shipping industry. It did a lot of damage to people who made things like, well, ships, ropes, all that kind of stuff, because they couldn't sell them to the British or to a lot of kind of global, a lot of the world powers that needed heavy shipping just weren't buying from France anymore, at least to nearly the same extent. And they couldn't really ship it overseas anyways because the British had blockaded all their ports. Also, things like lumber. You can get some lumber from Scandinavia, but really the best lumber comes from like Ontario or that places. Like one of the things I know in particular that whenever I go to provincial parks in Canada they talk about is white pines grow very tall and very straight, and it's ideal for masts. It makes the best quality masts, and most of the British fleet use masts made out of white pine. So obviously the French couldn't import that, and you can't really grow that locally. Even so, though, you figure they'd be able to cobble enough together to at least have local superiority. So, something I had never really thought about, but I was going through a lecture series. I think it was on the Royal Navy. I forget if it was on the Royal Navy or the British Empire. It doesn't really matter. But they pointed something out that I never thought of. The fact that the UK was blockading their ports meant that the French sailors couldn't train. And I mean, how do you train to use a man of war? How do you train in naval tactics? You have to drive the ship around, right? You got to get out. You have to have your sailors learn how to survive on ship. You have to learn how to do the sails. I mean, you can do some of this in dock, but really actual training, things like formations, because line ahead is very important. The French had absolutely no way to train this way, so their men were little better than really recruits or conscripts at this point in time. In contrast, the UK had the entire world's ocean to train. They could drill their crews as much as they want. They could float their ships around. The blockade alone probably gave their sailors a lot of experience in just surviving on ship. The UK also, I believe, by this point in time had lime juice, so their ships could stay out in the waves for a lot longer. But that was a really big factor. And I mean, if that's a little abstract for you, think about it this way. Think if in World War II, the Germans were unable to take their tanks outside of their garages. Like in the preparation for World War II maybe, or during World War II, aerial bombardment was so bad that the panzers just sat in the garages for the duration of the war until the last minute when they brought them out and desperately threw them at the enemy. They don't have the crews don't have an opportunity to, like I said, train, to do formations, do maneuvers, to shoot at targets, to shoot at moving targets. All these things are super important, and the French fleet wasn't able to do that. The French fleet also wasn't able to coalesce together. They had some ships in the Mediterranean, some in the Atlantic, they had the Spanish ones, etc. And because of the blockade, the British generally had local superiority in most locations. If the French could have gotten a bunch of ships together, they probably could have defeated the British in detail. But as it was, they would have to break out against superior numbers who had much better training and equipment. So it just really wasn't a possibility. So they would never really be able to get enough ships together to actually challenge the British. And their big attempt at that at Trafalgar failed horribly, and they lost a lot of their battle fleet, and it basically permanently crippled them. But my point being, overall, is much as with Sextus Pompey in the UK in World War II, the fact that they were willing to stay in and fight it out no matter what meant that ultimately they would be successful, at least on the sea. Because if they had once again pieced out with Napoleon, made a white truce, they might have been a white peace. Sorry, Napoleon might have been able to rebuild his navy at least enough so that he could challenge the British locally in some areas. Now, I doubt the French Navy was ever going to be as good as the British Navy, but being like 40% as good as the British Navy is a lot better than being like 5% as good as the British Navy. Once again, it would have also given Napoleon the opportunity to import a lot of raw materials and stuff from America and the rest of the world. So it is interesting. I think naval power is something that's very much underappreciated in history. In a lot of cases, the side with the superior navy beats the side with the superior army. Just because so much of trade occurs on the oceans, and just the ability to rapidly move troops wherever they need to be and to supply by the sea is just such a huge advantage. Anyways, that's just some of my brief thoughts on the matter, kind of a follow-up to the previous video. I hope you enjoyed it. This is Argent. As always, we must dissent.